All right, so get ready. Today, we're going to dive into a world you might not expect to be so colorful. Vintage Massey Ferguson tractors.
Oh, yeah.
Specifically, we're going to be talking about their paint.
Okay.
So we're talking Ferguson gray, Stoneleigh gray, even bamboo beige.
Wow.
And, if you're out there working on restoring one of these, finding the right paint is, it's mission critical.
Yeah.
So luckily for us, we've got this document called paint.pdf. And it looks like it was put together by a whole bunch of Massey Ferguson enthusiasts, and they're trying to help us decode this whole rainbow of colors of tractors.
You know what's really fascinating about this? It's not just about, slapping on any old shade of red.
Right.
This document, it really shows how much thought went into choosing these colors, and it reflects both like evolving design trends, but also some really practical considerations.
Yeah.
Like, did you know that the type of primer they used could actually affect the final color of the paint?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That's wild. It's like a history lesson you'd never get from just looking at, a tractor out in the field.
Right.
Okay, so this paint.pdf, it's mainly just charts, right?
Yeah, it's a lot of charts.
What's the best way to even, use these?
So think of these charts like your treasure map.
Yeah.
They basically connect those Massey Ferguson paint specs with codes from different manufacturers like DuPont, PPG, you name it.
Oh, okay.
So it's really helpful if you're trying to match like a modern paint to a vintage shade.
Got it.
But, gotta give you a little warning here. It's not always going to be a one-to-one match.
Right.
You might have to play around with it a little bit, experiment to get it just right.
Right, yeah. This document even mentions that even if you've got the right code, getting that original shade can be really tough.
Uh-huh.
You got to think about it. There are variations in mixing, the pigments, even how old the can of paint is. It all adds up.
Oh, for sure. And you also can't forget things like temperature, the humidity, even just slight differences between different batches of paint. Yeah. These factors that you think would be really small can have a huge impact on the final color.
Huh. So what's a restorer supposed to do? Is a perfect match even possible?
Huh. Well, perfection's a pretty high bar to set.
Yeah.
This document, it gives you the best chance. It's about, understanding those nuances that we talked about and being willing to try things out.
Yeah.
Remember, this is a restoration journey, not a race.
Right. And beyond just the paint itself, this document has some pretty cool stuff about how these tractors were made.
Oh, yeah.
Did you know that the time of day a tractor was painted could actually affect the shade?
Really?
Yeah. Apparently, if the pigment settled in the tanks throughout the day, it could actually change the color.
Oh, wow. That's what I love about this. It really humanizes the whole process. These weren't just machines being churned out on an assembly line.
Yeah.
There were real people mixing the paint, spraying it, dealing with all those little quirks.
Yeah.
So each tractor, it really becomes a little time capsule.
That's awesome. And then there's also these little bits of information about how to tell the difference between similar models, like the FE35 and the MF65 UK tractors. Turns out their diesel engines were a little bit different.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Did they use different paints for them as well?
Not necessarily, but you know what? The engines are a great example of how Massey Ferguson, even back then, they were balancing this global manufacturing with regional variations.
Oh, okay.
So the FE35 actually used a bunch of different starting aids during its run, while the MF65, it used 2 different Perkins engines.
Oh, wow.
So even if the paint's the same, you can use those little engine details to figure out the exact year and where your tractor came from.
Okay. So we've got our color charts, warnings about matching those vintage shades, even some tractor production trivia. What else makes this document so special?
I'd say it's the amount of collaboration behind it. You've got retired Massey Ferguson employees, paint experts, just passionate enthusiasts, all contributing their knowledge. So this document really represents like a community effort to preserve the history of these machines.
It's like a love letter to Massey Ferguson tractors.
It really is.
Speaking of which, I noticed the document mentions that those paint codes can be region-specific.
Oh, yeah.
Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, so even back then, Massey Ferguson was sourcing their paint globally.
Okay.
So different regions had different suppliers, and that led to different paint codes. So a DuPont code that works perfectly in North America might not give you the same color in Europe.
Oh, that's a really crucial detail for anyone trying to get that authentic look. So say I'm trying to match a specific shade of red, but I can't find a modern equivalent using those DuPont codes. What are my options?
Well, first, remember that the document says how important it is to test small samples before committing to a big batch of paint.
Right.
And you're in luck because the document also has codes from other manufacturers like PPG, and those are more likely to be consistent across the world.
Okay, so even if I can't find a direct match, there's still hope. This document really does feel like a treasure map for anyone trying to nail those vintage colors. And it sounds like understanding those regional differences is super important. Are there any other examples besides DuPont?
Oh, yeah, definitely. So the document says that BA/FRM stock numbers are generally pretty consistent globally, though you can't find all the colors everywhere.
Right.
But, it makes sense. Different regions might have different preferences or needs when it comes to paint.
Yeah, it's like the world of tractors was global, but still with these local touches.
Exactly.
So someone restoring a tractor in the U.S. needs to be aware that brands like Sherwin-Williams or Martin Senior might have codes that are only specific to the U.S.
Exactly.
Right.
Imagine the frustration if you tried to use a U.S. Sherwin-Williams code in, like, Australia.
Right.
You'd probably end up with a completely different color than what you were expecting.
Yeah, that would be a disaster. So for a listener who's, knee-deep in this restoration project, this document's obviously an incredible resource.
Oh, yeah.
But it sounds like it's just the beginning.
Yeah.
They need to be ready to do some research, maybe even experiment a bit, to really get those colors right.
Definitely. And that's what makes this so fun, right? It's not just following a recipe.
Right.
It's about understanding the ins and outs of paint, the history of the company, even the global manufacturing landscape back then.
Absolutely. Now, there's one thing that really stood out to me in this document. It's a warning about how even unopened cans of vintage paint might not give you the original color.
Right.
Why is that?
That's where the science of paint comes in.
Okay.
It's easy to think about paint as just pigments mixed together, but the composition, it's changed over time because of things like environmental regulations and just new technology. What was in a can of paint 50 years ago isn't the same as what we use today.
So even if I found an unopened can of, let's say, Ferguson gray from the 1950s, it might not match a freshly mixed batch using the same formula.
Exactly. Over time, things like pigment settling, chemical reactions happening inside the paint, even certain components breaking down, that can all change the color. It's almost like an aging process.
Oh, interesting.
Like a fine wine, the paint itself changes over time.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
So what's the takeaway for our listener who wants that authentic look? I mean, is it even achievable?
I think it is achievable, but you got to manage your expectations.
Right.
Don't get too caught up on absolute perfection. This document is your guide, but you might need to work with a good paint supplier. Test samples, fine-tune things to get as close as you can to the original.
It sounds like restoring these tractors is as much about science and history as it is about, mechanics and elbow grease.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so rewarding. You're not just fixing a machine, you're uncovering its story, layer by layer.
Speaking of stories, this document talks a lot about the collaborative effort behind it, but it also mentions some pretty cool details about the tractors themselves. Like, did you know that pigment settling in those paint tanks could lead to slightly different shades on tractors produced later in the day?
Yeah. Those little details are what really make these machines come to life,
Yeah.
It shows that each tractor is unique. It's a product of both the planned design and the human touch in the factory.
Yeah, we tend to think of mass production as this impersonal process, but this document really reveals the handcrafted element that went into each Massey Ferguson.
And it reminds us that even simple things like a paint job involve multiple layers, careful preparation, understanding of how different colors and finishes were going to work together.
Yeah, it's like those subtle brushstrokes in a painting that reveal the artist's hand. So we've got our paint codes, cautionary tales about vintage paint, a little glimpse into the world of tractor production back then. Where do we go from here? What other mysteries does this document hold?
Well, we've just barely scratched the surface of these FE35 and MF65 UK tractors.
Okay.
This document actually dives deeper into the details of their diesel engines, how they changed over time.
Ooh, let's unpack that. Tell me more about those engine differences.
Well, the FE35 especially, it went through some pretty interesting changes. The earliest models, the Mark Guns, they used a thermostat heater in the intake manifold.
Okay.
So basically, it's this little heating element to help get that diesel engine going on a cold morning.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. So they weren't always relying on glow plugs like we see in modern diesels.
Right. Then the Mark II came along, and they added something called key gas equipment.
Key gas, what's that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. From what I understand, it involved injecting a little bit of gasoline into the intake to help with starting.
Oh, okay. So like a hybrid approach before going full diesel.
Yeah, it seems that way. And then finally, with the Mark III, they switched over to 4 glow plugs in the cylinder head. The document also mentions something called start pilot equipment, but it doesn't really give us much more information about that.
That's okay. It's still pretty fascinating to see how much they were, like, tinkering with these engines to get them just right. What about the MF65? Did it have similar variations in those starting aids?
The MF65 is actually a bit simpler. I used a Perkins A4.192 engine, and then they switched to a Perkins A4.203 with the Mark II.
But both diesels, though.
Yep, all diesel. And while the document doesn't get into like the nitty-gritty of the differences between those two Perkins engines, it is pretty amazing how those seemingly small details can help you figure out the exact model and year of a tractor.
It's like having a secret decoder ring for Massey Ferguson history.
Exactly.
So for our listener who's maybe getting a little overwhelmed with all this engine talk, what would you say is the key takeaway here?
I think the takeaway is that even something as seemingly simple as a diesel engine went through this really significant evolution.
Right.
And understanding those subtle changes, whether it's the starting aids or the engine block itself, it helps you put together a more complete picture of your tractor's history.
It's all about piecing together the puzzle.
Yeah.
And this document really gives you the pieces to connect those engine variations to specific years and models, which, can be super helpful if you're working on a restoration.
Absolutely. And you know what else it highlights? It shows how Massey Ferguson, even way back then, was a global company,
Right.
but one that also paid attention to those regional needs and preferences. For example, the different starting aids on that FE35. That might tell us something about the different climates and conditions where those tractors were being used.
Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so we've talked a lot about paint codes, color match, and we even got into the evolution of diesel engines. But let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. What does this document tell us about Massey Ferguson as a company?
I think it shows us a company that was really in transition.
Okay.
You see the move from those early Ferguson gray and Ferguson light gray to the iconic MF35 red, and then eventually just plain MF red. It's like watching their brand identity develop right in front of you through color.
And it's not just the colors themselves, right? It's also all those different paint suppliers and the regional variations we talked about.
Yeah, for sure.
It paints a picture of a company that was expanding globally, but also trying to figure out how to deal with standardized production across different continents.
Exactly. They were trying to figure out how to balance efficiency with maintaining a consistent brand image all over the world. And that's a challenge that a lot of companies still face today.
It really is.
Yeah.
How do you scale up
Hmm.
without losing what made you successful in the first place?
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about that note we talked about earlier, how U.S.-built Massey Fergusons used the same colors as the U.S.-built MF35s, at least through the 100 series.
Right.
Was that just about saving money, or was there something more to it?
I think it could be both. Streamlining production makes sense from a business standpoint, but it also shows that they were paying attention to their customers.
Right.
Keeping things familiar for their existing customers while they were introducing new models probably helped them build trust and loyalty.
It speaks to a company that was thinking strategically about how they were going to grow,
Yeah.
but also about their relationship with the people who were actually buying and using their tractors.
I think that's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in all the technical details, but Massey Ferguson's success really came down to the trust and loyalty of farmers all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of those farmers, let's zoom in a bit and talk about the tractors themselves. Beyond just the nuts and bolts, what does this document tell us about their design and how they were put together?
Well, it definitely highlights the craftsmanship that went into these machines. Even something as simple as a paint job involved multiple layers, careful prep work, a deep understanding of how colors and finishes would interact. It wasn't just slapping on a coat of paint, it was a skilled craft.
Right. We talked about how even the time of day could affect the shade of the paint.
Yeah.
It reminds us that human hands were involved every step of the way and that each tractor has its own unique story.
And that human element is something we often lose sight of in today's world of mass production.
It's true.
These tractors, they were built to last, made with an attention to detail that's hard to find these days.
Yeah, you can almost feel the pride those workers took in their craft,
Uh-huh.
knowing that these tractors were going to be put to work, relied on by families and whole communities.
Exactly. And it's not just the paint, of course. The document also gives us some clues about how tractor design changed over time. Like those different starting aids on the FE35, they show us how engineers were constantly trying to improve how well these machines worked and how reliable they were.
It's that constant drive to innovate and make things better that I find so impressive. So for our listener who's maybe starting to appreciate just how much goes into restoring one of these, what would you say is the main takeaway about Massey Ferguson's design philosophy?
I'd say it was all about practicality, durability, and constantly trying to improve.
Okay.
These tractors were built to work, built to withstand tough conditions, and to change as the needs of the farmers using them changed.
And that spirit of innovation, I mean, it's still alive today, right?
Yeah.
Massey Ferguson is still a leader in agricultural technology.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's fascinating to see those roots in these vintage machines.
Yeah, and it reminds us that innovation isn't just about fancy new technology. It's about that constant, little by little improvement, that attention to detail that makes a machine truly reliable and effective.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Paint, engines, design philosophy. But there's another layer to this document that I find really interesting, and that's the human side of Massey Ferguson. What can we learn about the people who actually built and used these tractors?
Well, one of the things that really stands out to me is the sense of community and shared passion.
Yeah.
Just look at the list of people who contributed to this document. Retired employees, paint experts, enthusiasts. It really shows the impact these tractors have had on people's lives.
It really does. And it makes you realize that restoring a Massey Ferguson isn't just about fixing up an old machine. It's about connecting with that legacy,
Yeah.
with all the people who put their heart and soul into building and using these tractors.
It's about tapping into that shared history and becoming a part of the story.
Right. It's about understanding that these tractors were more than just tools. They were partners, companions, witnesses to how things changed in rural life.
And each one has its own story to tell. The scratches on the paint, the dents on the fenders, they all tell us something about how the tractor was used.
Now, for our listener who's about to jump into their restoration project, they've got this paint.pdf document.
Yeah.
And it's obviously a fantastic resource. But it sounds like it's just the beginning, right? Where should they go from here to really learn more?
You're absolutely right. This document is a great starting point. But it's just the tip of the iceberg. There's a whole world of information out there waiting to be discovered.
So what are some good next steps for our listener who wants to become a Massey Ferguson expert? Where should they go to find those stories and technical details?
I always tell people the internet, it's a restorer's best friend.
Oh, for sure.
There's just so much information online now.
Yeah.
AGCO, the company that owns Massey Ferguson, they've got a great website. You can find all sorts of stuff there. Historical archives, technical manuals, even old brochures and photos.
Oh, wow.
It's like you're talking directly to the source.
That's awesome. And we can't forget about those online forums and enthusiast groups.
Oh,
The
right.
knowledge those folks have is incredible.
Yeah.
You can ask questions, get advice, connect with other people who love these tractors.
Yeah, those forums are so helpful for troubleshooting problems, finding parts.
Yeah.
You just feel like you're part of something bigger.
Right.
Plus, you never know what you're going to find there. Some little hidden gem of information.
Right. Someone might have a rare brochure, a personal story about a certain model you can't find anywhere else.
Exactly.
It's like a treasure hunt.
And speaking of treasure hunts, don't forget about libraries and archives.
Oh, yeah.
Local historical societies, farm museums, even old farm magazines.
Right.
They can have a ton of information on Massey Ferguson tractors and the places where they were used.
It's amazing what you can find in those archives.
Yeah.
You might even find a picture of your tractor from way back when.
You never know.
It's like connecting with the past in a really personal way.
And sometimes the best source of information is right there in front of you, the tractor itself.
Oh, yeah. Good point.
Take your time, examine it, take notes on its features, even measure things.
Right.
You might find little details that tell you about its history or some unique thing about it.
Yeah, it's like being a detective, uncovering the secrets hidden in the machine.
Exactly.
And, don't be afraid to talk to other restorers or experts in your area.
Oh, yeah.
They probably have some great insights or tips from their own experiences.
It's all about using that network of knowledge and experience that's out there.
Right.
The restoration community is so generous. People are always happy to share what they know.
That really reminds me of that collaborative spirit behind the panty.pdf document.
Uh-huh.
All those contributors sharing their knowledge and love for these tractors is really inspiring.
It is. And it reminds us that restoration is best done together, whether it's on those online forums, local clubs, or just talking to a fellow enthusiast. That community makes the whole experience even better.
Now, for our listener who's just getting started on their Massey Ferguson restoration, it can feel a bit overwhelming. I mean, where do you even begin?
Well, I always suggest starting with a good plan. Figure out what kind of shape the tractor's in, what needs fixing or replacing, and come up with a realistic budget and timeline for the project.
So don't just dive in with a wrench and a can of paint.
Exactly. It's easy to get excited and want to jump right in.
Right.
But taking the time to plan and prioritize, it'll save you a lot of headaches later on.
Right, yeah, and break the project down into smaller, more manageable tasks.
Yeah,
Instead of feeling overwhelmed by the whole thing, focus on finishing one step at a time.
that's great advice. And remember, it's okay to ask for help. There are tons of resources out there, from experienced mechanics to online forums, even professional restorers.
Yeah, you don't need to be an expert mechanic to restore a tractor.
Right.
It's all about learning, adapting, and knowing when to get some guidance from people with more experience.
And speaking of experience, one of the things you learn is to document everything.
Oh, that's so important.
Take lots of pictures before you take anything apart, label all the parts, keep notes, write down any changes or repairs you make.
It's like making a trail of breadcrumbs so you can find your way back.
Exactly.
Believe me, those details, they can disappear from your memory pretty quickly.
They do.
Having good documentation is like having a backup for your brain.
And lastly, don't forget to have fun. Restoring a tractor should be enjoyable. Embrace the challenges, be happy about the wins, and really appreciate the satisfaction of bringing something back to life.
It's a labor of love.
It really is.
You're not just fixing a machine, you're connecting with history, learning new skills, and creating something really special.
And that sense of accomplishment, that's what makes it all worth it.
Now, before we wrap up, there's something really important I wanted to mention. Safety.
Right.
Working on these old tractors can be dangerous if you're not careful.
Oh, for sure. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of the project,
Yeah.
but safety should always be your #1 concern.
So for our listener who's ready to get their hands dirty, what are some key safety tips they should keep in mind?
Always wear the right safety gear, like eye protection, gloves, sturdy shoes. If you're doing any welding or grinding, you need a welding helmet and clothes that won't catch fire.
And don't forget about protecting your hearing.
Oh, that's right.
Those old engines can be loud, and listening to that for too long can damage your hearing.
Absolutely. And always work in a well-ventilated area, especially when you're using paints, solvents, any chemicals like that.
Right, those fumes can be harmful if you breathe them in, so make sure you've got fresh air circulating.
Exactly. And speaking of chemicals, always read and follow the instructions on the labels.
Oh yeah, good point.
They've got important information about how to handle, store, and get rid of them safely.
Right, and never work on a tractor that's only supported by a jack. Always use jack stands or other strong supports to make sure it doesn't accidentally fall on you.
Right, those heavy parts can really hurt you if they're not held up properly, not worth the risk.
No, absolutely not.
And finally, if you're ever not sure about something, just ask for help. There are so many resources out there, experienced mechanics, online forums, even those professional restorers. It's always better to be safe than sorry.
So much great advice. I think it's clear that we should never compromise on safety. By taking those precautions, you can really enjoy the restoration and create something amazing without putting yourself in danger.
Exactly. A beautiful restored Massey Ferguson is a testament to all your hard work, but it's even better when you do it safely and responsibly.
Well said. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the incredible world of Massey Ferguson tractors and their colorful history.
It's been great exploring this with you, and I hope our listener feels inspired to start their own restoration journey.
Yeah, we covered so much today, from paint codes and engine types to the importance of research, documentation, safety, taking care of the environment, and of course, patience. But as we always do, we want to leave you with something to think about.
If your Massey Ferguson tractor could talk, what stories would it tell?
Think about the places it's worked, the people who've driven it, the tough times it's been through. Those stories are all a part of it, and its metal, its paint, everything.
And by restoring it, you're becoming a part of that story, adding your own chapter.
So as you start this journey, don't be afraid of the challenges, enjoy the process, and let those stories inspire you every step of the way.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
And until next time, happy restoring.